So unlike the NBA and NHL, the National Football League has opted not to use any kind of bubble to try to keep coronavirus infections at bay when games resumed again. But as Week 5 approaches, questions are growing as to how much longer that approach is really going to work. First came the outbreak among the Tennessee Titans, with more than 20 players and personnel testing positive so far, and then a handful of other players around the league started testing positive as well, including Patriots quarterback Cam Newton over the weekend. And after the league postponed the team's game for just a single day, and the Patriots flew to Kansas City on 2 different planes, 2 other team members have since tested positive. New England shut down its practice facility yesterday and today, but as of now, they are still planning to play Denver on Sunday. In all, the NFL says at least 84 players and staff members have tested positive for COVID since the season started, not counting this week. And on Monday, they announced they're adding new video surveillance to make sure teams are adhering to COVID protocols and upping the penalties for violations, which could now lead to lost draft picks and possibly even forfeits of games. But is that enough? I'm joined by Ben Volin, senior NFL writer at the Boston Globe, who just wrote a piece titled, "As COVID-19 cases mount, the time is rapidly approaching for Roger Goodell to pause the 2020 NFL season." Ben, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me today.
Can you start off by explaining why the NFL decided not to go with the bubble approach and instead to use the more decentralized approach to COVID containment that they did?
Sure. I think when you look at it realistically, it's not practical to do an entire NFL season, 4 months of regular season, plus another month of training camp, and then another month of playoffs. That's 6 months to ask people to remove themselves from society, to not see their wife and kids. You know, it's one thing for the other sports, basketball and hockey, to do a bubble for the postseason. A couple teams had to do it for 2.5 months, but it's a huge ask to try to stage an entire season inside a bubble. And not to mention just logistically, in the NFL with injuries, you have a lot of guys coming and going on your roster, and you need to be able to bring guys in for tryouts and to work guys out and to have flexibility with your roster. So the NFL, I think, you know, and everything they do is in conjunction with the NFL Players Association too. So it's an equal partnership there. The owners and the players, I think, both decided that a bubble just isn't practical, isn't realistic. And instead, they've instituted this wide-ranging program of testing and contact tracing. And it's held up pretty well so far, but we're certainly starting to see some cracks in the protocols.
Before we get into the cracks, I want to ask you one more question about the approach they've used to date. My understanding, tell me if I'm wrong, is that the NFL has let the different teams work out their own protocols in conjunction with local health authorities. Is that correct? Am I getting that right?
No, yes and no. The protocols really are across the board for all 32 teams, okay. But I think built in is the fact that teams are required to work with their local health boards and their health experts. And say for a game in San Francisco, if the local authorities there, they say that everyone has to wear a mask, then you'll see the players wearing the masks on the sideline. I believe San Francisco and Buffalo are like that. And you saw the TV announcers, Al Michaels and Chris Collins, where they had to wear masks during their broadcast in San Francisco. Whereas, you know, here in New England, the mask rules aren't as restrictive. But overall, you know, the NFL hired one single company to handle all the testing. They set up 32 testing sites at each team facility, and they collect the samples every day, 6 days a week. They're testing guys. Every player, every coach is wearing a tracking device on their wrist or on their leg all day long, so that if someone does test positive, they can go back and determine who the close contacts were. And then there are, you know, very strict rules about social distancing and masks and how many people can be in the weight room or the cafeteria, and strict protocols for travel and hotels. And I mean, the NFL has taken this thing very serious. And, you know, the masks have been tough. And that's one area where the NFL is starting to threaten not only fines, but suspensions and loss of draft picks, because that's one area where they've seen a lot of slippage so far.
That brings up something I wanted to ask you. Rules are obviously great, but they only work if people actually adhere to them. What's the adherence been like? I mean, are people wearing masks in situations where the league tells them to, or are people, you know, staying out of the weight room if the league is telling them to go, and if there's a certain number of guys in there, or are people kind of blowing off those rules or guidelines?
Well, certainly during games, we've seen a lot of coaches be very cavalier about the mask rule, and you know, they We saw Ravens coach John Harbaugh. He pulled off his mask, got right in an official's face, and was screaming at him a couple weeks ago. And you sit there and you wonder, with everything going on, how can that be allowed? And the NFL has had to fine 5 different coaches so far $100,000 each for not wearing their masks during the game. And that's been something where they've really cracked down. The NFL has also had to crack down on player gatherings outside of the team facility. The Las Vegas Raiders a couple weeks ago had a charity event on a Monday night for one of the players' foundations, and a bunch of players were there in an indoor environment, not distancing, not wearing their masks. The NFL handed down a bunch of fines. So it's interesting. It's like the protocols worked so well for the first month and a half of the season. Training camp, the first couple weeks, really went off without a hitch, and probably better than anyone expected. There were very few positives, very few cases, no outbreaks. I think people started getting lax a little bit, and the NFL has had to come down with a heavy foot a little bit and had to punish the players and coaches for not adhering to the rules. But with the Titans outbreak and what's going on with the Patriots, it does seem like the message is being sent right now about how serious it is to adhere to all these policies.
Do you think that message that is being sent right now, and we talked about the possible increased sanctions at the outset, do you think it's going to be enough? Or, as you suggested in that column of yours, might we be facing the fact that in a situation like the one we're in, a public health emergency like this, a pandemic, that it's really not viable to make football work, a full season of football work, even if the rules are very carefully thought out and the testing protocols and all that? What do you think?
I mean, we'll see. The Titans situation is very disconcerting that one person in the organization had it, was exposed to some people. Everyone on the Titans tested negative on Saturday. They flew out to Minnesota, played their game, and then when they came back, boom, 8 guys one day, and then it's up to 23 people now have tested positive. So that's certainly been a frightening case for the NFL. That said, the Titans also didn't follow the rules. It's being investigated now that while they were supposed to be isolating, the players got together on their own and worked out outside the team facility. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why they have an outbreak. And maybe if they did, follow the rules more closely, maybe they wouldn't have outbreaks. The NFL is going to push forward. They think they can control the outbreak. They think they have enough testing and tracing and enough roster flexibility that they can make it work. But, the Patriots situation right now is also like a big litmus test. If it's only relegated to just three players so far, then we've avoided an outbreak. But, the virus is only supposed to get worse as the months get colder. Yeah. And at some point, if there are multiple outbreaks, it's going to be hard to move games around and to push forward. It wouldn't be the worst idea. Roger Goodell just took a timeout and paused the season for a week or two, let everyone get healthy, and maybe even fix some holes in the protocols. 2
quick questions for you. I got to ask before we part ways here. It was reported today that Cam Newton and Stephon Gilmore had dinner after Newton had been tested. ESPN, I believe, broke this. Bill Belichick kind of dodged a question about it today. Do you have any special intel on that situation?
I don't have anything extra to add. If they did go out for dinner, I would need to know some more context. Was it in a crowded restaurant? Were they sitting outside versus indoors? It's hard to be disappointed in either of them. They didn't know they were positive at the time. Cam Newton, he didn't know at that point that he was positive. Certainly Stephon Gilmore didn't. And, there's no rule necessarily preventing them from going out to dinner. However, the NFL does have a punishment. If they determine that they went into a crowded restaurant or were acting recklessly, then there could be a suspension or some sort of punishment aspect. But as of now, it doesn't appear anything nefarious.
Final question. It's a biggie, but I got to ask you to keep it brief, even though I'm throwing it at you. Is there something about the culture of football as a sport, which I think of as being in ways that baseball or basketball, other sports are not, maybe even hockey, although hockey could be close to football? I think of football as prizing an attitude in which, if you're hurt, you suck it up. You try to play if you can. Even if you've got, a broken hand, you try to get back on the field. Or, if you've got some injury that would knock people out in other sports, you don't indulge your weakness. You drive through it. And that's a way of showing how strong and committed you are. I don't know if I'm mischaracterizing that ethos, but if I'm even in the ballpark, is that part of the challenge here when it comes to the NFL keeping people safe?
Yeah, and I think that's any professional athlete. A lot of alpha males usually in that line of work. And, I think even me, I get sick and you try to push through it. And you say, oh, it's not a big deal. And I can go to work today and I'm not going to go to the doctor. I don't need to get it checked out. I can figure it out on my own. And absolutely in the NFL, there's a mentality of, rub some dirt on it and get back in there. But that has changed, I've seen, over the last few years, especially with concussions, as the awareness with concussions has increased. You have seen players self-report more often and understand the risks involved. And I think a lot of players do understand the risks involved with coronavirus. But the challenge with this is you just never know where the virus is lurking. And a very innocent trip to CVS could result in you getting the virus. So this is such a different opponent than anyone in the NFL or any of us have ever faced before. And that the biggest challenge is they're trying to play through a pandemic, and this is unprecedented times in the NFL. And they've shown some cracks in the system, but they still believe that they can get the ship righted and continue on a course to complete the NFL season.
All right, Ben Volin, thank you. Good to talk to you.
Thank you very much.